What happens when a land once called Venezuela, Little Venice, by European explorers becomes the stage for some of the fiercest struggles for freedom in the Americas, only to be bound by the very wealth hidden beneath its soil? This is Venezuela. From native empires and Spanish conquest, to independence wars led by Bolívar, and finally, to the world's largest oil reserves. Yet behind the glow of black gold lies a history of blood, rebellion, and untold secrets. Before Columbus's sails appeared on the horizon in 1498, Venezuela was not an empty canvas awaiting European discovery. It was a living world, a mosaic of tribes, cultures, and landscapes that stretched from the misty Andean highlands to the endless Caribbean coast. The land already had a heartbeat, one shaped by centuries of indigenous presence. The Carib, fierce warriors and skilled navigators, ruled the northern coasts. They moved swiftly in canoes carved from single tree trunks, their paddles striking rhythm with the tides. Their reputation was both feared and admired, for they defended their territory with relentless courage. To outsiders, they were brutal. To their own, they were guardians of the shore. The Arawak, by contrast, cultivated the fertile valleys. They planted maize, cassava, and beans in terraces that hugged the hillsides. Life revolved around cycles of planting and harvest, ceremony and song. They were artisans too, potters who molded clay into vessels decorated with spirals, animals, and suns. Every pot told a story, every symbol held meaning. Further inland lived the Timoto-Cuica, whose civilization built stepped agricultural systems long before Europeans spoke of progress. Their towns were organized. Their houses stood on stone foundations, their fields irrigated with channels that shimmered under the sun. They lived in relative peace, exchanging food and crafts with neighboring tribes. Their strength was not in conquest, but in continuity. Across the region, spirituality guided daily life. The sun was worshipped as giver of strength, the moon as protector of dreams, the earth as mother of all. Rituals filled the air with smoke and chants. Shamans painted their bodies with dyes from the annatto plant, red like fire, yellow like dawn. They believed spirits lived in rivers, in mountains, in storms. To them, the world was alive. And yet, these societies were not isolated. The Caribbean Sea was a highway. Canoes glided across its turquoise expanse, carrying shells, salt, cotton, and stories between islands and mainland. A necklace of trade linked Venezuela to the wider Caribbean. What one tribe lacked, another supplied. What one discovered, all eventually shared. Life was not idyllic, however. There were conflicts, raids, rivalries, and shifting alliances. The Carib often clashed with the Arawak. Villages were burned, captives taken. Survival demanded both resilience and adaptation. But for centuries, the land sustained its people, and its people shaped the land in return. When Europeans arrived, they saw opportunity. But what they could not see was the depth of history beneath the soil. The silent voices in every stone tool, every ceramic shard, every terrace carved into a mountain. They mistook unfamiliarity for absence. They believed they were the first to name rivers, mountains, and lakes. In truth, every place already had a name. Imagine standing on the shores of Lake Maracaibo before 1498. The waters stretched wide, reflecting the sky like a mirror. Stilt houses rose from its shallows, connected by wooden walkways. Children dove into the warm water. Fishermen cast nets at dawn. Women wove baskets in the shade. Drums echoed in the distance. This was not wilderness. It was home. The richness of Venezuela's indigenous heritage is often overshadowed by the drama of conquest and independence. Yet without these first chapters, the story is incomplete. The resilience of today's Venezuelan identity, its music, its food, its rhythms, owes much to the Carib, Arawak, and Timotoquica. Their blood runs in the veins of the nation. Their memory whispers in the landscape. Centuries later, anthropologists would marvel at their ingenuity. Archaeologists would unearth their pottery, their tools, their burial mounds. Linguists would trace Arawakan and Caraban words in modern Venezuelan Spanish. But for the people who lived it, there was no need for validation. They knew who they were. They were children of the land, of rivers and mountains, of sky and sea. And so, when Columbus's men stepped ashore in 1498, they did not enter an empty world. They entered a stage already filled with actors, traditions, and meaning. The arrival of Europeans did not begin history in Venezuela. It disrupted it. It twisted its course. But the roots remain, deep beneath the soil, holding the memory of those who first called this land home. This was Venezuela before it had a name. A land of balance, conflict, and beauty. A land that breathed with its people. A land about to be forever changed. When Alonso de Ojeda sailed westward in 1499, accompanied by the Florentine navigator Amerigo Vespucci, the Caribbean was still an ocean of mystery to Europeans. They had heard of islands rich in gold, of shores filled with spices, of lands where rivers shone like silver. What they found instead was something unexpected. Gliding into the waters of Lake Maracaibo, the Spanish ships encountered a vision unlike anything they had ever seen. Along the shallow edges of the lake, houses stood on stilts, connected by fragile wooden bridges. Smoke rose from kitchens where fish were drying. Children leapt from ladders into the water, their laughter echoing across the lake. For Ojeda and Vespucci, it resembled the canals of Venice. They whispered the word Venezuela, Little Venice. That name would linger, altered over time into Venezuela. It was a word born not from the people who lived there, but from the gaze of strangers who sought to define what they saw. For the native tribes, this land had countless names already, each tied to rivers, mountains, and spirits. Yet the foreign word would prevail, stamped onto maps, treaties, and histories, until it became the identity of the nation itself. But a name is never innocent. Behind Venezuela lay the shadow of conquest. The Spanish did not come merely to admire. They came to claim. Ojeda's expedition marked the beginning of an era of intrusion. Alongside Vespucci was Juan de la Cosa, a skilled cartographer whose maps would redraw the Atlantic world. Together, they charted coasts, marked harbors, and noted places for potential settlement. Every stroke of ink on parchment was a step toward erasure of the local order. By the early 1500s, Spanish expeditions multiplied. They were drawn not only by the landscapes, but by rumors. Rumors of pearls along the Caribbean coast, rumors of gold in the mountains, rumors of tribes rich with resources. Explorers saw the indigenous stilt houses not as homes, but as curiosities to be cataloged, exploited, and eventually replaced. Trade soon followed conquest. Spanish ships carried pearls harvested from the island of Margarita, taken by force from the seabed by indigenous divers compelled to risk their lives. Salt, fish, and cotton were seized and transported back to Europe. The waters of Venezuela, once highways of exchange between tribes, became arteries of extraction for a distant empire. Violence was never far behind. Skirmishes broke out as local communities resisted Spanish encroachment. The Carib, in particular, known for their ferocity, refused to submit quietly. Raids struck Spanish settlements. Retaliation followed with steel and gunpowder. Villages burned. Bodies floated in rivers. For the first time, indigenous warfare met European weapons, and the balance shifted. Still, resistance did not vanish overnight. For decades, Spanish expeditions faced fierce opposition. Ambushes erupted in dense jungles. Canoes attacked galleons under cover of night. Native leaders fought to protect sacred lands and ancestral waters. But as disease spread, smallpox, measles, influenza, the numbers dwindled. Enemies the tribes could not see proved deadlier than any sword. Meanwhile, Spain's grip tightened. The crown granted licenses to colonists to settle, to mine, and above all, to control labor. Enslavement became systematic. Indigenous people were forced into encomiendas, bound to Spanish settlers under the guise of protection. In reality, it was servitude. Fields once cultivated for local needs now produced goods for European markets. The name Venezuela spread across Europe as explorers and merchants spoke of its riches. To some, it was exotic, a land of strange dwellings over water. To others, it was opportunity, a place where fortunes might be made at the expense of native lives. To the people who lived there, it became the mark of intrusion, a sound that carried loss. Imagine a Carib elder standing at the shore of Lake Maracaibo as Spanish sails appeared again and again. He sees the stranger's hunger for land, for pearls, for power. He hears them call his home Little Venice. Does he laugh at the absurdity? Or does he sense the danger in being renamed by those who would not honor the name he already knows? The act of naming is powerful. It can connect, but it can also conquer. In calling the land Venezuela, the Europeans laid the first brick in a structure of domination that would last centuries. A word born of admirations became a banner under which conquest marched. By the mid-16th century, Spanish settlements dotted the coast. Towns emerged, ports opened, and missionaries spread across the land. Venezuela was no longer a distant shore. It was a colony in the making. The indigenous vision of water, earth, and sky as sacred was drowned by the European vision of land as profit. And so the story of Venezuela's name is also the story of its first wound. It is the moment when a home was redefined by outsiders, when a people's identity was overshadowed by foreign maps, when Little Venice became the prelude to centuries of control. The irony remains. What the explorers saw as Venice was nothing like Venice at all. It was older, more rooted, more alive than any European canal. But history rarely favors accuracy over power. And in this case, the name Venezuela, misunderstood, misplaced, imposed, would endure. This was the birth of a name, and with it, the birth of a tragedy. The Spanish conquest did not arrive all at once. It unfolded gradually, like shadows creeping over a valley at sunset. At first, expeditions touched the coastlines. Then missionaries ventured inland. Soon, Caracas would rise, and with it, the long centuries of colonial rule. By the mid-16th century, Spain had consolidated its claim. Caracas was founded in 1567 by Diego de Losada, chosen as the new heart of administration. Nestled between mountains and valleys, it became both fortress and marketplace. From here, decrees of empire spread across the land. The system of encomienda took root. It was presented as protection, a paternalistic arrangement in which Spanish settlers cared for the native people in exchange for labor. In reality, it was exploitation. Indigenous families were forced to work fields, to build roads, to harvest crops that would never feed them. Resistance was met with lash and sword. As disease continued to devastate the original inhabitants, enslaved Africans were brought in chains across the Atlantic. Ships unloaded human cargo in Caribbean ports, feeding the demand for labor on Venezuelan soil. They were forced into cacao fields, into coffee plantations, into tobacco farms. Their sweat watered the crops that filled European coffers. Their cries mingled with those of the indigenous people, both caught under the weight of empire. By the 17th century, cacao became Venezuela's golden crop. Its beans were shipped to Spain, roasted in aristocratic kitchens, and turned into a delicacy for nobles. Coffee and tobacco followed, swelling the colony's wealth. Yet prosperity was never shared equally. A small elite of peninsulares, Spaniards born in Europe, held power. Beneath them stood criollos, Spaniards born in the Americas, frustrated by exclusion. At the very bottom were those whose labor sustained the system: the indigenous, the enslaved, the mixed-race poor. The colonial hierarchy was rigid, almost architectural. At the top, crowns and bishops. Below them, soldiers and merchants. Beneath still, farmers and servants. At the foundation, the enslaved. A pyramid of power designed to keep order, but also to keep injustice permanent. Caracas grew, but it was a city of contradictions. Its churches rang with bells calling the faithful. Its markets bustled with cacao sacks and tobacco bundles. Yet just beyond its walls, villages of the poor lay in hunger. Processions celebrated saints, while chains rattled in fields. The cross and the whip often walked side by side. Spain's grip was not only economic, but cultural. Catholicism was spread by missionaries who traveled to remote valleys, baptizing children, burning idols, renaming rivers and mountains. Indigenous traditions retreated underground, preserved in secret ceremonies, in whispered songs, in hidden altars. The colonizers sought to erase, but memory resisted in shadows. Pirates, too, haunted the coasts. The Caribbean was a contested sea, stalked by English, Dutch, and French corsairs. Villages burned, ports looted, ships ambushed. The people of Venezuela learned that their land was not just a colony, it was a prize fought over by empires. Security was fragile, and fear was constant. Despite oppression, seeds of resilience sprouted. Enslaved Africans preserved rhythms in drums, weaving them into festivals that survived in defiance. Indigenous patterns adorned pottery still made in hidden valleys. Criollo children read forbidden books smuggled from Europe, ideas of equality and liberty flickering like sparks waiting for wind. Colonial Venezuela was therefore a paradox. On one hand, it was exploited, controlled, bled for profit. On the other, it was alive with cultures that refused to vanish. Beneath the silence imposed by empire, a quiet murmur of resistance grew. For Spain, the colony was a distant possession. For the people who lived there, it was daily struggle. Hunger stalked the poor even as galleons left ports heavy with cacao. Families were torn apart by slavery even as elites dined in mansions. The soil was rich, but its wealth drained outward. By the 18th century, discontent simmered. Criollo elites resented peninsulares monopolizing power. Common people resented endless labor for the benefit of others. Enslaved Africans longed for freedom, whispering stories of rebellion from other islands. Indigenous communities, though diminished, still remembered the days before conquest. All these tensions coiled together, silent yet explosive. Caracas in 1780 looked peaceful to the eye. Streets lined with colonial houses, plazas where children played, churches where candles flickered. But beneath the cobblestones lay centuries of anger, of pain, of loss. The air carried whispers of a coming storm. Colonial Venezuela was a house built on fragile foundations. For now, Spain held it firmly. But every pyramid built on injustice eventually cracks. Every silence imposed by force eventually breaks. In the valleys, in the plantations, in the narrow streets of Caracas, history was preparing its next chapter. And that chapter would begin with a word the Spanish feared most: independence. The 18th century was not kind to empires. Across the Atlantic world, the air itself seemed charged with new ideas. Ideas carried by books, by ships, by whispers in taverns. In Caracas, those whispers grew louder with each passing year. The Enlightenment spoke of reason, of rights, of liberty. The American Revolution showed that colonies could rise and overthrow kings. The French Revolution thundered across Europe with its cry of liberté, égalité, fraternité. Venezuela was listening. In 1806, Francisco de Miranda returned. An old soldier of many causes, he had fought in the American Revolution and witnessed the upheavals of France. His heart burned for freedom in his homeland. With a small band of followers, he attempted to land on Venezuelan shores to ignite rebellion. The attempt failed, but the seed was planted. The people had seen what was possible. By 1810, the world had changed. Napoleon had invaded Spain. The Spanish king was imprisoned. Across the colonies, loyalty wavered. Was the crown still legitimate? Was obedience still required? In Caracas, the answer was no. April 19, 1810, the city's cabildo, its council, met under tense skies. Crowds gathered outside. Peninsulares argued for continued loyalty to Spain. Criollos demanded self-rule. Voices clashed in the chamber. Then, a decision. Caracas would no longer recognize Spanish authority. It was the first spark. A year later, in July 1811, Venezuela declared independence. Bold, fragile, unprecedented. It was among the first colonies in South America to break from Spain. The document bore signatures of men who knew the risks. They were defying the most powerful empire of their age. But independence on paper is not the same as independence in reality. Spain struck back. Armies marched. Battles erupted in valleys, plains, and mountains. Villages burned. Patriots were hunted. Executions filled plazas with fear. Yet the flame would not die. New leaders emerged, young and relentless. Among them was Simón Bolívar. Bolívar was born into privilege, a criollo of Caracas. But he carried within him the fire of revolution. Educated in Europe, he had walked the streets of Paris during the height of revolutionary fervor. He believed freedom was destiny, not a dream. In 1813, he launched the admirable campaign, sweeping across Venezuelan territory, liberating towns, proclaiming justice. He earned the title El Libertador, the liberator. Still, the struggle was brutal. The war was not simply Spain against Venezuela. It was Venezuelans against Venezuelans. Royalist forces included not only Spaniards, but also locals, criollos, mestizos, and enslaved people who feared what independence might bring. Neighbors fought neighbors, families split apart. The war was a civil war as much as it was a revolution. The violence was staggering. Fields once green with cacao turned red with blood. Executions became spectacles. The revolutionaries answered cruelty with cruelty. No one was untouched. Independence demanded a terrible price. But the call could not be silenced. Even in defeat, patriots regrouped. They sought allies in New Granada, in Europe, anywhere hope still lived. They dreamed of not just a free Venezuela, but a free continent. Bolívar's vision stretched beyond borders. He imagined Gran Colombia, a union of nations standing together against tyranny. Caracas itself felt the weight of revolution. Streets that once echoed with merchants' cries now thundered with marching boots. Churches rang bells not only for mass, but for alarms. At night, whispers of betrayal haunted households. Was your neighbor loyalist or patriot? Was your cousin friend or foe? Trust evaporated. Only resolve remained. By the late 1810s, the movement had gained momentum. Victories, though hard-won, began to shift the tide. Bolívar, Miranda, and countless others became names carried on banners, carved into memory. Spain's empire, once ironclad, was fracturing. Independence was no longer a question of if, but when. Yet even as liberation loomed, the path was uncertain. What kind of nation would rise? Who would rule? Could criollos truly share power with the poor, with the enslaved, with the indigenous? The revolution promised freedom, but freedom for whom? In plazas across the colony, patriots spoke to crowds. They promised equality, justice, dignity. Faces lifted with hope. But beneath the speeches lay deeper tensions. Tensions that would not vanish with independence. The call for liberty was clear, though. It echoed from Caracas to Maracaibo, from the Orinoco to the Andes. It was sung in songs, scribbled in pamphlets, whispered in prisons. It was a call that united, even as it divided. Independence was no longer just an idea. It was a demand, written in the hearts of thousands, carried on the voices of men and women who refused to kneel. And once a people begin to dream of freedom, no empire can stop them. The Declaration of 1811 was bold. It was historic, but it was also fragile. Independence was not secured by ink and signatures. It had to be won by fire and steel. Spain was determined to crush the rebellion. Armies arrived, loyalist militias mobilized, and the colony descended into chaos. What began as a political act turned into one of the bloodiest wars South America had ever seen. The early republic was shaky. Earthquakes in 1812 devastated Caracas, toppling churches and burying homes. To many, it felt like divine punishment. Royalists seized the moment, declaring the tremors proof that God opposed independence. Spirits faltered. Francisco de Miranda, once the great precursor of freedom, surrendered under impossible odds. He was betrayed, arrested, and sent in chains to Spain, where he died in prison. The dream of liberty seemed to collapse, but a young officer refused to let it die. Simón Bolívar stepped forward. In 1813, Bolívar launched his admirable campaign. Marching from New Granada, his forces swept into Venezuela. Town after town fell. Patriots cheered as banners of independence rose again. Bolívar entered Caracas a hero, hailed as El Libertador, the liberator. Yet glory was short-lived. The war was brutal and its cruelty unmatched. Royalists and Republicans alike committed atrocities. Prisoners were executed without trial. Civilians were massacred for suspected loyalties. Entire villages were erased. The conflict tore Venezuela apart, turning brother against brother, neighbor against neighbor. Bolívar himself declared a policy of war to the death in 1813. His proclamation promised protection for American-born patriots, but threatened death to any Spaniard who resisted independence. It was a message of terror, but also of resolve. The revolution would show no mercy to oppressors. Battles raged across the plains, in the jungles, and along the coasts. The llaneros, cowboys of the vast plains, became decisive players. At first, many sided with the royalists. Fierce riders, skilled with lances, they were formidable opponents. But as the war dragged on, Bolívar and his allies won their loyalty, transforming them into one of the revolution's deadliest weapons. Among Bolívar's key allies was José Antonio Páez, a Llanero leader whose charisma and military brilliance electrified his followers. Under Páez, cavalry charges thundered across battlefields, piercing Spanish lines with speed and ferocity. The revolution gained momentum. Still, the road to victory was long. Spanish reinforcements poured in from Europe. The Caribbean coast became a battleground of ships, ports, and fortresses. Hunger stalked the patriot armies, disease decimated ranks, and desertion spread. At times, Bolívar seemed destined to fail, but the liberator was relentless. He retreated when necessary, regrouped, and struck again. His vision was larger than one battle, larger than Venezuela itself. He dreamed of a united South America, a federation of free nations that could stand against any empire. From 1817 onward, the Patriots reorganized. Bolívar established bases along the Orinoco River, creating a new republic in Guyana. From there, he rebuilt his army, secured supplies, and rallied support. Slowly, the tide began to turn. By 1819, Bolívar launched one of his most daring campaigns. Crossing the flooded plains of the Llanos during the rainy season, his troops endured waist-deep water, swarms of insects, and exhaustion. Then they climbed the freezing Andes, a feat as punishing as it was heroic. Many died along the way, but those who survived descended upon New Granada like thunder. At the Battle of Boyacá, Bolívar triumphed, liberating Colombia. Venezuela's fate was tied to this larger struggle. The final blows came in the early 1820s. At Carabobo in 1821, Bolívar's forces, aided by Páez's cavalry, shattered the Spanish army. It was the decisive battle for Venezuelan independence. Spanish resistance lingered in some strongholds, but the backbone of colonial power was broken. The war was won. Yet the cost was staggering. Hundreds of thousands lay dead. Fields lay barren. Cities lay in ruins. Families were torn apart forever. What emerged was a nation free from Spain, but scarred by war. Bolívar's dream of Gran Colombia was born in this crucible. Venezuela joined with Colombia, Ecuador, and later Panama in a single republic. But unity proved fragile. Old divisions simmered beneath the surface. Regional leaders demanded power, and the sacrifices of war made compromise difficult. For the moment, however, the people rejoiced. After centuries of conquest and decades of blood, the chains of empire had been broken. Venezuelans could finally call themselves free. But freedom was only the beginning. The challenges of building a nation, of healing wounds, of defining power, of uniting diverse peoples were just beginning. The war for independence was over. The struggle for stability had only just begun. Independence brought freedom, but not peace. The chains of empire had been broken, yet the wounds of war remained raw and bleeding. What followed in 19th century Venezuela was not harmony, but turbulence. A cycle of conflict, ambition, and endless struggle. Gran Colombia, Bolívar's dream of unity, was the first to fracture. In theory, it was noble. Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, and Panama united as one great republic. In practice, it was fragile. Regional rivalries burned. Leaders clashed over power. Criollo elites wanted influence for themselves, not distant central governments. By 1830, Gran Colombia disintegrated. Venezuela emerged as an independent republic, but already divided. The new nation was unstable. Constitutions were drafted, amended, abandoned. Presidents rose and fell in rapid succession. Coups erupted like storms. Political life was dominated by caudillos, strongmen who commanded loyalty through charisma and violence rather than law. José Antonio Páez, the llanero hero of independence, became the first president of the Republic. He embodied both promise and peril. To his followers, he was a protector. To his opponents, he was a dictator cloaked in patriotism. Under Páez, the Republic stumbled forward, fragile and uneven. The economy was weak. Fields ravaged by war lay abandoned. Infrastructure was scarce. The cacao and coffee trade resumed, but profits filled the pockets of a few, while the majority remained impoverished. Wealthy elites controlled the land, while peasants worked under harsh conditions. The dream of independence turned bitter for many who had fought for it. Throughout the 19th century, Venezuela was rocked by civil wars. Dozens erupted, some brief, others devastating. Each claimed to fight for justice, for reform, for the people. In truth, many were battles for personal power, fought by ambitious generals with loyal militias. One of the most destructive was the Federal War, 1859 to 1863. It began as a call for federalism, regional autonomy against central authority. It ended as a national catastrophe. Towns burned, thousands perished. Fields turned to wastelands. The war left scars so deep they reshaped society itself. Out of this chaos emerged a pattern. Venezuela was governed not by stable institutions, but by the will of caudillos. They wore uniforms, not robes. They wielded sabers, not laws. Some promised reform, others enforced repression, but all ruled through force. Ordinary people suffered most. The poor were conscripted into armies, forced to fight wars they barely understood. Families were uprooted, crops destroyed, futures stolen. For peasants, war was a curse that never ended. For elites, it was a chessboard of power. The church remained influential, guiding spiritual life and shaping politics, but even faith could not shield the people from hardship. Droughts came, famines followed, epidemics spread. Survival became a daily battle, independence or not. By the late 19th century, another force entered the story: oil. For centuries, black liquid seeped naturally from the ground, ignored or used casually by locals to waterproof boats. But by the 1870s and 1880s, foreign eyes noticed. Industrialization demanded energy. What lay beneath Venezuelan soil would soon transform its destiny. At the same time, leaders like Antonio Guzmán Blanco attempted to modernize. He ruled with both iron fist and vision, building railroads, schools, and monuments while crushing opponents. He centralized power, enriched himself, and left behind a legacy both admired and reviled. Yet modernization did not bring equality. Venezuela remained a land of contrasts. Grand boulevards in Caracas, poverty in the countryside, railroads for commerce, hunger for farmers. Progress was real, but it was not shared. The cycle of coups continued. Dictators replaced dictators. Promises of democracy surfaced, then vanished under military boots. By the dawn of the 20th century, Venezuelans were weary of instability. Generations had known only war, caudillos, and fragile hope. Still, history was preparing another turning point. The discovery and exploitation of oil in the early 20th century would change everything. No longer would Venezuela's wealth come from cacao or coffee. The black liquid beneath its soil would shape politics, society, and destiny for the next century. But oil, like liberty, carried a price. It promised riches. It threatened ruin. The era of caudillos and civil wars was fading. The age of oil, and with it a new kind of struggle, was about to begin. The 20th century opened with a whisper of change beneath Venezuelan soil. It was black, it was thick, and it promised more wealth than cacao, coffee, or tobacco ever could. Oil. In 1914, at a site near Lake Maracaibo, a well known as Zumaque, I struck oil. What burst from the ground was not just petroleum, it was destiny. Overnight, Venezuela shifted from a forgotten corner of South America to a nation with a resource the modern world craved. At first, production was small. The infrastructure was weak, the market uncertain. But global events soon accelerated the boom. World War I and later World War II created insatiable demand for fuel. Companies from Britain, the Netherlands, and the United States poured in, drilling, refining, exporting. By the 1920s, Venezuela was one of the largest oil exporters in the world. The transformation was staggering. Small fishing villages on Lake Maracaibo turned into bustling oil camps. Wooden shacks gave way to derricks. Fires burned at night, marking the skyline with flames. Roads, ports, and pipelines carved across landscapes that had once been quiet fields. But prosperity was deceptive. The wealth flowed outward, into foreign companies, into the hands of a small Venezuelan elite, into the coffers of dictators. The majority saw little change. Farmers were displaced. Indigenous lands were invaded. Pollution tainted rivers and air. Oil was wealth for some, burden for others. The political landscape shifted with oil's rise. Juan Vicente Gómez, who seized power in 1908, ruled Venezuela for nearly 3 decades. He understood oil's power. He welcomed foreign companies, ensured contracts, and enriched himself and his allies. Under his dictatorship, Venezuela modernized superficially. Roads were paved, cities grew, revenue increased. But freedom shrank. Opposition was crushed, dissent silenced, and prisons filled. Oil was both his weapon and his shield. By the mid-20th century, Venezuela's reputation soared. It became known as the Saudi Arabia of Latin America. Revenues poured in, financing grand projects. Caracas glittered with new buildings, universities, and highways. Migrants from Italy, Spain, and Portugal arrived, drawn by the promise of opportunity. For a moment, Venezuela looked like a nation reborn. Yet the foundations were unstable. The economy became dependent on oil alone. Agriculture withered, manufacturing stagnated, and inequality widened. The countryside emptied as workers flocked to cities, chasing promises of oil money. But jobs were uneven, inflation climbed, and slums spread on Caracas's hillsides. This paradox gave birth to a phrase that would haunt Venezuela forever: the resource curse, or more vividly, the oil curse. The very wealth meant to save the nation, instead, shackled it. When oil prices soared, Venezuela celebrated. When prices fell, crisis followed. Boom and bust became a cycle, trapping generations. Social unrest simmered. Workers in the oil fields demanded rights, wages, dignity. Students in Caracas rallied for democracy. Intellectuals warned of dependence and corruption. But those who held power, politicians, military men, and foreign companies, saw little reason to change. Oil was too profitable to question. By the 1940s, however, democracy briefly flickered. Reforms promised education, labor rights, and a fairer distribution of wealth. Yet coups followed elections, and generals replaced reformers. The shadow of the caudillo still lingered, wearing modern clothes but wielding the same iron hand. Still, oil had bound Venezuela to the global economy. Every shift in price, every war abroad, every decision in Washington or London rippled into Caracas. The country's fate was no longer its own. It was tied to barrels of crude sold on markets oceans away. Ordinary Venezuelans lived this contradiction daily. In Caracas, skyscrapers rose, theaters opened, cars filled the streets. But in the barrios, families struggled with poverty, lacking clean water or steady work. Oil created two Venezuelas, one gleaming with modernity, the other crumbling in neglect. The promise of oil was intoxicating. Politicians declared it the key to progress. Newspapers hailed it as a gift from God. Yet beneath the optimism, unease grew. Could a nation truly build its future on one resource alone? What would happen when the wells slowed, or when prices collapsed? These questions hung in the air, unanswered. Oil had made Venezuela visible on the world stage. It had filled treasuries, paved roads, and fed ambitions. But it had also planted seeds of dependency, inequality, and corruption. By the mid-century, one thing was clear. Venezuela was no longer defined by cacao or coffee. It was defined by oil. Black gold shaped its cities, its politics, its destiny. And like all treasures, it carried both promise and peril. The age of oil had begun, and with it, a new chapter of Venezuelan history, glittering, turbulent, and cursed. Oil made Venezuela rich. It also made Venezuela fragile. Power became concentrated not in the people, but in those who could control the flow of black gold. And so the 20th century unfolded as a pendulum, swinging between dictatorship and democracy, between repression and fragile hope. Juan Vicente Gómez set the pattern. He ruled from 1908 until his death in 1935. Nearly 3 decades of iron-fisted control. His regime opened the gates to foreign oil companies, giving them concessions while he accumulated immense personal wealth. Roads, telegraphs, and new cities appeared. But the cost was freedom. Opposition was hunted down, exiled, or silenced. For ordinary citizens, Gómez was both father and jailer. When Gómez died, Venezuela stood at a crossroads. The oil boom had transformed the nation, but democracy was still a dream. Military leaders filled the vacuum, each promising reform, each tightening control. Stability meant obedience, not liberty. Then came Marcos Pérez Jiménez. A general, ambitious, and authoritarian, he rose to power in the late 1940s and ruled officially from 1952. Under his command, Venezuela glittered. Skyscrapers pierced Caracas's skyline, highways sliced through valleys, and grand public works projects announced the image of a modern nation. Oil money paid for everything. But behind the glass and concrete lay fear. Torture chambers operated in secret. Dissidents disappeared. The press was censored. The government declared progress while silencing anyone who questioned its methods. Caracas looked like a capital of the future, but the regime ruled like the past. Yet dictatorship could not last forever. By 1958, resentment boiled over. Students marched, workers protested. The military split. On January 23rd, Pérez Jiménez fled the country, carried away by an airplane into exile. Crowds filled the streets, celebrating not just the end of a ruler, but the rebirth of possibility. Venezuela entered a new era, democracy. For Latin America, the shift was remarkable. While many neighbors endured juntas, coups, and repression, Venezuela built a constitutional system. Political parties emerged, most notably Acción Democrática, AD, and COPE, the Christian Democrats. They formed a pact known as the Punto Fijo Agreement, pledging to respect election results, share power, and protect the democratic framework. It worked, at least for a while. Elections were held. Presidents changed through ballots, not bullets. Oil revenues funded schools, hospitals, and housing projects. Venezuela became known as a showcase democracy in a continent scarred by authoritarianism. To many, it was proof that democracy could flourish in Latin America. Caracas thrived. Migrants arrived from war-torn Europe, from Colombia, from the Caribbean, seeking opportunity. Universities expanded, cultural life blossomed, and the economy boomed. Middle-class families bought cars, televisions, and modern apartments. It was an age of optimism. But beneath the optimism, cracks appeared. Oil wealth was not infinite. Corruption spread through government contracts, siphoning billions into private hands. Politicians grew complacent, treating the state as a spoil system. Inequality widened. For every modern apartment in Caracas, there was a hillside barrio of tin shacks. For every new school, there were children who still went hungry. The democratic system itself grew rigid. AD and COPEI dominated politics, alternating power like partners in a dance. Smaller parties and independent voices found little space. Democracy existed, but it was controlled, stable on the surface, exclusionary underneath. Ordinary people began to lose faith. For the poor, promises of redistribution felt hollow. For the young, corruption tainted ideals of liberty. For the rural population, democracy seemed like a game played in Caracas, far from their daily struggles. By the 1970s, oil prices surged again, giving the illusion of endless prosperity. The state nationalized the oil industry in 1976, creating PDVSA, the State Oil Company. Politicians promised that Saudi Venezuela had arrived, that oil would finally fund true equality. Luxury flooded in, from imported goods to extravagant projects. But when oil prices fell in the 1980s, the illusion shattered. Debts mounted. Inflation rose. Poverty returned with a vengeance. The same democracy once hailed as a model now looked fragile, corrupt, and out of touch. Dictatorship had been replaced. But the dream of true justice was still elusive. Venezuela's democracy was young, brave, and inspiring. Yet it was also vulnerable, dependent on oil and haunted by the same old curse. Wealth without equality. The stage was set, and from the cracks of this fragile democracy, a new figure would emerge, one who promised to tear down the old order and give the people back their voice. His name was Hugo Chavez. By the 1980s, the Venezuelan dream was cracking. The oil boom had turned into an oil bust. The government, bloated with debt, could no longer sustain the illusions of prosperity. Supermarkets emptied, prices soared. Families who once believed in Saudi Venezuela now lined up for bread. The crisis reached its breaking point in February 1989. President Carlos Andrés Pérez, under pressure from the International Monetary Fund, announced austerity measures. Gasoline prices rose, bus fares doubled. For the poor, it was unbearable. Caracas exploded. Crowds filled the streets, looting shops, clashing with police. The uprising, known as the Caracazo, turned into bloodshed. Soldiers opened fire. The government declared a state of emergency. Official figures spoke of hundreds killed, but survivors whispered thousands. Bodies were buried in mass graves. Trust between the people and the state was shattered. For young military officers watching from the barracks, the lesson was clear. The old order was broken. Among them was a paratrooper named Hugo Rafael Chavez Frias. Born in 1954 to a poor family in the plains, Chavez grew up playing baseball, dreaming of being a pitcher, and sketching portraits of Bolívar in his notebooks. His idol was not just a hero, but a destiny. He joined the army, rising through the ranks, cultivating loyalty among fellow officers who shared his vision of change. The Caracazo radicalized him. Chavez saw a corrupt political class, two dominant parties, AD and COPEI, trading power while the poor suffered. He began to plan. In secret meetings, he and his comrades formed the Movimiento Bolivariano Revolucionario 200, a clandestine network devoted to overthrowing the system and creating a new Venezuela. In 1992, Chavez struck. Tanks rolled in Caracas. Soldiers seized military bases. The coup was bold, but disorganized. Loyalist forces regained control. Dozens died. The plot collapsed. Chavez was arrested, but he refused to vanish quietly. Allowed a moment on national television, he spoke directly to the nation. Compañeros, for now, our objectives have not been achieved. Those two words, for now, turned defeat into prophecy. Overnight, Chavez became a symbol. To millions, he was not a failed rebel, but a future leader who dared to challenge a corrupt elite. While in prison, Chavez studied, wrote, and refined his vision. His release in 1994 only expanded his influence. He toured barrios, spoke with workers, listened to farmers. His message was simple but powerful. Venezuela needed a revolution, a Bolivarian revolution. By the late 1990s, the system was collapsing under its own weight. Corruption scandals plagued politicians. Poverty engulfed the majority. Disillusionment grew. When elections approached in 1998, the people were ready for change. Chavez campaigned not as a traditional politician, but as a soldier, a man of the people, a new Bolívar. He promised to rewrite the Constitution, to distribute oil wealth fairly, to give power to the poor. His charisma electrified rallies. He quoted Bolívar, sang folk songs, and spoke with the cadence of the barrios. The elites dismissed him. Foreign analysts underestimated him. But the people embraced him. In December 1998, Hugo Chavez won the presidency with a landslide. It was a political earthquake. For the first time in decades, Venezuela had broken free from the Punto Fijo system. A new chapter began. Chavez moved quickly. He called for a new constitution, approved by referendum in 1999. It expanded presidential powers, extended terms, and renamed the country the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. To supporters, it was a rebirth. To critics, it was the foundation of authoritarianism. But one thing was clear. Chavez had tapped into something real. He embodied the anger of the poor, the frustration of the working class, the hope of those long ignored. He was not just a president, he was a movement. Yet the question lingered. Could this movement deliver lasting change? Or would it repeat the same cycle, power, wealth, and betrayal that had haunted Venezuela for centuries? The 1990s had ended with Chavez triumphant. The 2000s would test whether his revolution could survive. Hugo Chavez came to power with a promise. Oil would finally serve the people. No longer would it enrich only elites or foreign companies. Black gold, he declared, was Venezuela's ticket to justice. At first, it worked. In the early 2000s, global oil prices soared. Billions of dollars flowed into Caracas. Chavez used it to fund massive social programs called misiones. Clinics opened in barrios where doctors had never set foot. Literacy campaigns taught thousands to read. Subsidized food markets appeared, offering rice, beans, and milk at low prices. For the poor, Chavez was a savior. He nationalized the oil industry, asserting state control over PDVSA, the powerful state oil company. Executives who resisted were fired, replaced with loyalists. Oil wealth, Chavez declared, belonged to the nation. He spent freely, pouring money into education, healthcare, and housing. At rallies, he held up the Constitution as a symbol of people's power. The charisma was undeniable. He sang on live television. He quoted Bolívar, Christ, and Marx in the same speech. He wore red shirts, the color of his revolution. To his followers, he was comandante, a leader who spoke their language, ate their food, and shared their pain. But critics saw another picture. Oil wealth was being drained recklessly. Infrastructure decayed. Corruption festered. The middle class fled as polarization deepened. For every Venezuelan who adored Chavez, another despised him. His foreign policy was equally bold. He railed against the United States, calling George W. Bush the devil at the United Nations. He forged alliances with Cuba, Russia, and Iran. He sold cheap oil to allies across the Caribbean, buying loyalty abroad while shortages loomed at home. He dreamed of a multipolar world with Venezuela at its center, powered by oil and revolution. Yet oil was both gift and curse. When prices stayed high, Chavez's model seemed unshakable. Poverty rates dropped. Inequality narrowed. Latin America hailed him as the champion of the poor. But when prices fell, the illusion cracked. Programs starved of funding collapsed. Inflation rose. Imports dwindled. The very dependence on oil that Chavez had promised to break became deeper than ever. Opposition mounted. In 2002, a coup briefly removed him from power. Business elites, segments of the military, and foreign interests supported the move. But masses of Chavez's supporters flooded the streets. Within 48 hours, he was restored to office, stronger than before. The failed coup only confirmed his narrative. He was the voice of the people against powerful enemies. Still, the divisions tore Venezuela apart. Elections remained, but they were drenched in accusations of fraud, intimidation, and manipulation. Chavez won repeatedly, his charisma overwhelming. But each victory widened the rift. Families argued, friends broke apart. The nation was split into two Venezuelas, Chavistas and anti-Chavistas. Meanwhile, the oil fields aged. Maintenance was neglected, investment lagged. Production slowly declined, but spending did not. Instead, the government borrowed heavily, confident that oil prices would remain high. It was a dangerous gamble. Chavez, once a fiery soldier, also faced his own mortality. In 2011, he announced he was battling cancer. Treatments in Cuba weakened him, but he refused to step aside. On television, he appeared smiling, joking, promising victory, not only against illness, but against poverty and imperialism. His followers prayed, cried, and vowed loyalty. By 2012, he won another election, still adored by millions. But his health was failing. In December that year, he named Nicolás Maduro as his successor. In March 2013, Chavez died. His funeral drew crowds so immense that streets overflowed with grief. For his supporters, it felt like Bolívar himself had died again. The legacy was complicated. To the poor, he had given dignity, healthcare, and hope. To his critics, he had squandered billions, polarized society, and left Venezuela more dependent on oil than ever. This was the paradox of Chavez. He lifted people up, but tied them tighter to the very resource that cursed them. He promised liberation, but left fragility. His revolution was real, but it was built on the unstable foundation of oil. The oil curse had not been broken. It had been deepened. And as Nicolas Maduro inherited power, Venezuela would discover just how heavy that curse could become. When Nicolas Maduro stepped into Chávez's shoes in 2013, he inherited not just the presidency, but an empire of contradictions. Oil money had built loyalty, but also dependency. The poor adored Chávez, but the state's finances were crumbling. Maduro promised continuity, calling himself the son of Chávez. But continuity, in practice, meant crisis. Almost immediately, oil prices fell. Revenues collapsed. Programs that once seemed untouchable, subsidized food, free healthcare, housing projects, ran out of funds. The government responded by printing money. Inflation began to rise. Then it spiraled. By 2016, Venezuela was in hyperinflation. Banknotes lost value within weeks. Prices doubled, tripled, then multiplied beyond comprehension. Families carried bags of cash to buy a loaf of bread. Supermarket shelves emptied. Hospitals lacked medicine. Parents fed their children once a day, sometimes only arepas of cornmeal. Hunger spread in a land with the world's largest oil reserves. Maduro blamed foreign conspiracies. He accused the United States of economic warfare, of sanctions designed to starve Venezuela. He pointed to elites, smugglers, and opposition leaders as traitors. His rhetoric echoed Chávez's defiance, but his charisma lacked the same fire. To his opponents, Maduro was not a revolutionary. He was a tyrant clinging to power. The opposition, emboldened by crisis, rallied millions. Protests filled Caracas, demanding Maduro's resignation. Tear gas, rubber bullets, and live ammunition answered them. Streets burned, walls filled with graffiti. Maduro, vete ya. Go now. International pressure mounted. The United States, the European Union, and many Latin American neighbors refused to recognize Maduro's re-election in 2018, citing fraud and intimidation. Instead, they recognized Juan Guaidó, the head of the National Assembly, as interim president. For a moment, two Venezuelas existed. One ruled by Maduro with military backing, the other symbolically led by Guaidó with foreign recognition. But power lay in barracks, not declarations. The military stayed loyal to Maduro. The opposition fractured. Guaidó's momentum faded. Maduro endured. Meanwhile, the humanitarian crisis deepened. More than 7 million Venezuelans fled the country, creating one of the largest migrations in modern history. They walked across Colombian borders, sailed to Caribbean islands, or boarded buses through the Andes. Doctors became taxi drivers abroad. Teachers cleaned houses in foreign cities. Families split, leaving grandparents behind. A once proud nation emptied into exile. Inside Venezuela, survival became improvisation. People bartered goods when currency failed. Communities relied on remittances from relatives abroad. Black markets thrived, offering soap, rice, or gasoline at prices few could afford. Life shrank into a daily struggle. Find food, find medicine, find a way to live until tomorrow. Maduro clung to allies: Cuba, Russia, China, Iran. Oil still flowed, but sanctions restricted exports. Gold from mines in the Orinoco Belt filled some gaps, often under brutal, exploitative conditions. The state survived not through prosperity, but through resilience, repression, and foreign backing. To his supporters, Maduro was the defender of sovereignty, standing against imperialism. To his critics, he was the author of disaster, presiding over collapse. To ordinary Venezuelans, he was simply the face of a nightmare they could not escape. The irony was bitter. A nation with the world's largest proven oil reserves had citizens eating from garbage bins, Hospitals lacked running water while oil refineries stood silent. Power outages plunged cities into darkness. Children fainted from hunger in schools. Teachers abandoned classrooms. The promise of Chávez's revolution had turned into ruins. Yet still, Maduro endured. Protests waned. The opposition, exhausted, fractured further. Many Venezuelans stopped dreaming of political change and focused only on survival. Some joked darkly, "Dictators die in bed, not in palaces under siege." By the early 2020s, negotiations flickered between government and opposition, brokered by Norway, Mexico, or the Vatican. Agreements were signed, then broken. Sanctions were loosened, then reimposed. Hope came and went like waves on the Caribbean shore. But the scars remained. Families scattered. Children grew up abroad, speaking Spanish with Colombian or Peruvian accents. A generation of Venezuelans learned resilience through exile. Those who stayed behind learned resilience through scarcity. The crisis was not just economic, it was psychological. A collective trauma etched itself into the national memory. To live in Venezuela under Maduro was to carry both pride in the nation's beauty and despair at its suffering. Maduro survived. The people endured. But the cost was immeasurable. And so Venezuela entered the 21st century not as the Saudi Arabia of Latin America, but as a paradox, rich in resources, poor in life. The oil curse had claimed another victim. Venezuela today is a country of paradoxes. The soil beneath its feet contains more oil than any other nation on earth. Yet its citizens stand in long lines for bread, medicine, and gasoline. Rich and poor, proud and broken, a land of beauty and despair. The 21st century has not been gentle. Years of crisis have reshaped daily life. For millions, survival means improvisation, cooking with firewood during blackouts, carrying buckets of water when taps run dry, bartering flour for soap. These are the realities of a nation once hailed as the jewel of South America. And yet, Venezuela refuses to vanish. Culturally, it remains vibrant. In barrios, music still rises: salsa, joropo, reggaeton. Painters, poets, and writers continue to create, using art to resist despair. Baseball diamonds still host children dreaming of the major leagues. Festivals celebrate saints with drums and dances older than the republic itself. Even in hunger, there is rhythm. Even in darkness, there is color. Politically, the nation lives in tension. Nicolas Maduro holds power, backed by the military and foreign allies. The opposition struggles, fragmented but persistent, demanding free elections and accountability. The international community debates sanctions, negotiations, and recognition. The future remains uncertain, a chessboard where every move feels both urgent and fragile. But beyond politics lies the human story. More than 7 million Venezuelans live abroad. An exodus that reshaped the continent. Cities from Bogota to Santiago, from Miami to Madrid, are filled with Venezuelan voices. They work as doctors, musicians, street vendors, engineers. They carry memories of arepas, of Caribbean sunsets, of mountains rising above Caracas. They send remittances home, lifelines for families left behind. Those who remain inside Venezuela endure with resilience. They plant small gardens, fix broken machines, invent solutions from scarcity. They survive not because of the state, but despite it. Each day lived becomes an act of defiance. The irony is haunting. Venezuela once dreamed of becoming a fortress of self-reliance. Instead, it became trapped in the chains of its greatest resource. Oil promised salvation, but delivered dependency. Prosperity flowed, then collapsed, again and again. The curse of black gold remains, yet hope lingers. It lingers in the memory of Simón Bolívar, who dreamed of freedom. It lingers in the songs of Ali Primera, the voice of the people. It lingers in children who study by candlelight, in migrants who still call their homeland mi patria, in the belief that no curse is eternal. History teaches that nations are not defined by their worst moments, but by their capacity to rise again. Venezuela has fallen many times, under conquest, under caudillos, under dictators, under crises. And yet, each time, it has stood again. The 21st century is still young. Venezuela's story is not finished. It is a land scarred, but not silenced. A nation exiled, but not erased. One day, the curse of oil may be broken. One day, the dreams of liberty may be fulfilled. One day, the world may see Venezuela not as tragedy, but as triumph. Until then, its people carry both the burden of history and the fire of hope. And that, perhaps, is Venezuela's greatest secret.